Hi, I'm Mark Trexler with The Climatographers and theclimateweb.com. Now, in the past week or so, you may have seen this story or a story like it pop up in your newsfeed, having to do with sea level rise being a lot worse than we might have anticipated. And I want to use this as an example of how you can use the Climate Web to check out this and other topics that you might want to dig into a little bit more. And why is this worthwhile? Well, let me point you to some of the news stories having to do with the topic of bounding sea level rise. And we'll do this we're in the Climate Web right now. If you go, for example, to this news story from 2017, October of 2017, what's the headline? New science suggests ocean could rise more and faster than we thought. Well, what if you go to this headline from March of 2016? Well, drastic Antarctic melt could double global sea level rise. Well, does that mean that between 2016 and 2019, estimates of sea level rise have risen eightfold? No. And in fact, I would suggest that there's a real issue here from a communications perspective, that if sea level rise is jumping all over the place and if these projections are coming up and then sort of retreat later on and sort of the alarmist headlines, so to speak, of doubling come up, it really feeds into a narrative that we see from people trying to demean or denigrate the climate science, that we have no idea what we're talking about, and that sea level rise science is totally uncertain. And so why should anyone listen to it? And so I just want to use this as an example of how you can dig deeper into this issue in the Climate Web without getting too deep into the numbers. So just let's click back on the Yahoo News story. Now you can see that we've linked to that the actual story. So this is the actual study that that these headlines came from. And a lot of this often, as usual, has to do with the headlines not quite being in sync with the underlying study, and that actually causes a lot of damage. But here you can see we've pulled sort of key information from this study. But what it also shows is that this is part of a larger literature around the topic of bounding global sea level rise. And there's actually a very large literature on that topic. And this is a key question of, how bad could sea level rise be? It's a huge question. And lots of studies and papers and other things are relevant to this question. But what you'll see is you can, and a lot of this is depends on the topic, et cetera. It's a matter of sort of exploring what you can find in the Climate Web. But this is linked to an index entry called Bounding Sea Level Rise, which is sort of what we're talking about here. Now, if you click on that index entry, you'll see the two things that I've showed you already. You'll also see a graphics category, a graphics heading called How Much Sea Level Rise. Now, all of these graphics in here are relevant to the question of how much sea level rise can we expect, but there's actually a subset called probabilistic sea level rise forecasts, and that's what was involved in this 2019 paper that we started with sort of estimating the probabilities of different levels of sea level rise. That doesn't happen in a lot of the studies out there, partially because, as sea level scientists have pointed out, we've never been in this situation before. So the planet has never been in the situation that we're in before now in terms of the level of atmospheric forcing, et cetera. So the idea of probabilities is sort of a misnomer, since we don't know the probabilities, since it's never happened before. That said, our human, the way we think sort of demands probabilities. And so people want to come up with the probabilities. And so you go and you do the expert elicitation, you get the probabilities. Fine. I'm not going to go into a lot of the numbers here, but what you can see is you can actually look back at the literature to 1983. And if just, for example, if I click on that thought, you'll see that it's part of a paper, Hoffman, an EPA paper from 1983, projecting sea level rise. So, the documents go back decades. And if you look at these documents in terms of levels of potential sea level rise that we've been talking about now over a period of more than 30 years, it turns out it's all in the same ballpark. we've been talking about, sea level rise of 6 feet, 10 feet by 2100 since the 1980s. So I'm not going to show you all the details. You can investigate it for yourself in the Climate Web. I'm simply pointing out how you can dig deeper into these stories and sort of ferret out some of the underlying detail on your own. And I think it's important to the topic of how we communicate climate change, how we communicate climate risk. I hope that's useful. Thanks.